Today I will be reading from Acts 9:36 through 42. In Joppa, there was a disciple named Tabitha. In Greek, her name is Dorcas. She was always doing good and helping the poor. About that time, she became sick and died, and her body was washed and placed in an upstairs room. Lydda was near Joppa, so when the disciples heard that Peter was in Lydda, they sent 2 men to him and urged him, "Please come at once." Peter went with them, and when he arrived, he was taken upstairs to the room. All the widows stood around him crying and showing him the robes and other clothing that Dorcas had made while she was still with them. Peter sent them all out of the room. Then he got down on his knees and prayed. Turning toward the dead woman, he said, "Tabitha, get up." She opened her eyes, and seeing Peter, she sat up. He took her by the hand and helped her to her feet. Then he called for the believers, especially the widows, and presented to them alive. This became known all over Joppa, and many people believed in the Lord. May God bless the hearing and the reading of his word.
Thank you, Abby. Abby's my niece, and she's heading to college this fall, so give her a round of applause. So, thank you, Abby. If you're just joining us today, we're about halfway. This is the halfway point of a summer series we're doing where we're looking at the 2 great commandments that God gave us, to love God and love others. And we've been talking about, worshiping and praying and learning and how those connect with loving God with heart, soul, and mind. Next week, we're going to pivot into the 2nd commandment, loving neighbors ourselves, and talk about how giving and playing connect us in love to our neighbors. And today, we're going to talk about what I see kind of as the pivot point, how, the bridge between these 2 commandments, that as we love God with all of our strength, we do so by using our strength to serve those around us. So when I was thinking about, the example of biblical strength, the first place my mind went was Samson. Like, if you don't know Samson's story, he is the strong man in Israel. Like, he's kind of like our Paul Bunyan, Like, there's all these legends and stories about how incredible his strength was. One day he's walking along the road, and a lion jumps out at him. And he just grabs the lion by the jaws and rips it in half. Or there's another story about Samson where he makes a bet with Philistines for 30, garments. His wife kind of gives the answer to the riddle to the Philistines. He owes them 30 garments. So how does he settle the debt? Well, he just goes into a nearby Philistine town, beats up 30 Philistines, takes their clothes, and repays the bet. And the Philistines are pretty mad about this, and so then they hunt him down, and the Israelites, and the Israelites are scared because they have an army of like 1,000 Philistines, and so they demand his surrender, and he agrees to protect the Israelites, and they bind him in ropes and so forth. But then as soon as they take him away, he breaks the ropes, and then he grabs the bone of a donkey, the jawbone of a donkey, and he beats 1,000 men single-handedly. He is the epitome of strength. And the Bible is clear as where does his strength come from? It comes from God's Spirit. Again and again and again, whenever Samson does these mighty feats, it says the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon him so he could tear lions apart, strike down 30 men, break ropes upon his arm like they just were like charred grass. But the more I thought about it, I somehow got led away from Samson to this character in the New Testament who is in some ways the anti-Samson. I'm speaking about the woman we just heard about in the story named Tabitha. Whereas Samson was a judge, a ruler and leader over the people of Israel, Tabitha, she had no real authority. She was a woman who couldn't own property or wealth in her day and time. Whereas Samson was a picture of strength, physical specimen. Tabitha was not. By the time we encounter her in the book of Acts, she's actually sick and very close to dying. What strength Tabitha had was in her hands. She was a skilled seamstress who made clothes for widows and orphans in her society, for the poorest of the land, people who fell outside the social safety net of her day. And I want to make the case, I want to argue that she was every bit as strong and spirit-filled as Samson was. But to do that, I got to take you back to the Old Testament again. And I want to take you to a passage before Samson was even on the stage. This is the story of the tabernacle in the book of Exodus. The book of Exodus devotes about 10 chapters to the creation of the tabernacle, which was like the mobile temple that the people used to worship God as they wandered around in the wilderness. And these 10 chapters, God gives the Israelites very specific instructions. You know, every detail of every aspect of the tabernacle is laid out. And it's, if you think about it, it's the first communal project that all of the Israelites share in. Before that, it's Moses doing miracle after miracle after miracle. But the creation of the tabernacle, this was a group project. And so all the Israelite community contributed. Those who had silver gave silver. Those who had gold gave gold. Some people had wood, and they took those and made the tent poles with them. And some had iron and made the tent pegs to kind of hold the ropes in place. And among all those who contributed were the women of the community. Picking it up in Exodus 35, it says, every skilled woman spun with her hands and brought what she had spun, blue, purple, and scarlet yarn and fine linen. And all the women who were willing and had the skill spun the goat hair. You think about, you know, a moving tabernacle, how much fabric there was in that. The tent, the coverings of the Holy of Holies, the coverings for the Ark of the Covenant, the garments for Aaron, the priest, that they all wore when they were serving before the Lord. The women were involved in the creation of all of that. Now, you've heard me say this a lot of times, that sometimes our English translations don't do justice to the poetry and beauty of the original languages. So in this case, what we just read, it says every skilled woman, that's in English, the NIV. But at the original Hebrew reads like this: all the women who are wise-hearted with their hands. Isn't that a beautiful expression? And then the next verse says all the women who are willing and had the skill. That's our English translation. But in the Hebrew, it's all the women whose hearts were stirred with wisdom. You know, last week I talked about loving God with our minds. This is what the women were doing. They were wise-hearted with their hands. They were stirred with wisdom. They used what they knew, the skills they had acquired, in order to serve God. One more example. This one's from Exodus 35. This is from Exodus 28. When Moses first gave the instructions, the call out to the women to participate, he said, this is God telling Moses, tell all the skilled workers to whom I have given wisdom in such matters, that they are to make garments for Aaron for his consecration. Wow, that's a boring way of putting this, right? So let's look at the Hebrew. It doesn't say tell all the skilled workers to whom I've given wisdom in such matters. Instead, the Hebrew original says tell all the artisans whom I have filled with the spirit, the ruach, of wisdom. It's the same spirit that filled Samson. It's the same filling that Samson received when he split the lion in two, when he bested all the Philistines. This same spirit fills the women who are involved in the making of the tabernacle. Reflecting on this, Dr. Jack Levison, one of my favorite seminary professors, he writes this. He says, Israel's sowers and spinners, the weavers and workers, they're not just talented, they're not just learned, they are inspired. Which normally when we think about inspiration, we only think about, you know, something that comes out of the blue, like out of nowhere, boom, it hits us. You know, we're inspired, like knowledge or insight or ideas that come from outside of us. But Jack says that's not exactly what's happening here. This is God using and filling the gifts they already possess. The key word in the Hebrew here is fill, which is male or mala, depending on how which gender appears in male or female, male or mala. And we translate that as to fill. But this isn't like a filling from outside, like when I fill a cup, with a pitcher, like I did with the baptismal pool. That's not the word, what it means. Usually when you see this word male or mala in the Old Testament, it means to fill from the inside. So it's when a woman is full with child, growing from the inside. Or when the robe of his temple fills, his robe fills the temple. Or when it talks about the fullness of time, when time reached its fullness, or even a promise being fulfilled. It's not being poured in from the outside, It's rather when God grows something from the inside out. So perhaps a better translation is not to fill, but rather to make full. Got it? So let me take you back to Jack for a second. He says, so this simple phrase, whom I have filled with the spirit of wisdom, it's really about bringing to completion, fruition, wholeness, fullness, the skills that we have practiced, the wisdom we have gained little by little. These expand dramatically when the Spirit in us inspires and equips us for challenging, demanding tasks. In this story of inspired artists, skill and spirit, divine inspiration and human effort, they are joined together at the hip. So that's what it means to be filled. It's God taking what's already inside us and growing it and magnifying it to meet the challenges that are ahead of us. Make sense? So now we know what filling is. Now let's look at that word strength. Because here's the trick. The Hebrew word for strength doesn't mean physical strength. It doesn't mean Samson. Actually, the Hebrew word for strength is meod, and it means fullness or muchness. So in addition to your physical strength, it's the skills you have, the knowledge you've acquired. It's the position you hold. It's the relationships you treasure. It's everything God has given you to make a difference in the world. That's your strength, your meod. And here's the beautiful thing, is when we love God with all our meod, all our fullness, then God, in turn, fills us. So let's take you back to the story of Tabitha, okay? Tabitha, as I said, was not a notable person in her society. She kind of occupied one of the lower rungs of the ladder. She's the kind of person that you would walk by and pay no attention to because she just wasn't that important. And yet, she used her fullness, her meod, her strength, in order to care for the poorest of the land. She provided clothing for those who had none. When Jesus tells the parable of the goat and the sheep, and he says to the sheep, "Enter into my kingdom, you who are blessed, for you saw me naked, and you gave me something to wear. For as you've done for the least of these, you've done it for myself." That's what Tabitha was doing. Jesus was speaking about people like Tabitha. But the story goes not just about so pick it up in Acts. It says Tabitha was always doing good and helping the poor. This was her way of life. But then Tabitha got sick and she died. And if that was the end of the story, it'd still be a good story of Tabitha using all that she had in order to serve those around her. But that's not the end of the story. She became sick, she died, and her body was washed and placed in an upstairs room. But then the disciples in that region, in the city of Joppa, they knew that Peter was nearby, and so they sent word to Peter, and they said, "Please come at once." And I find myself thinking about Peter. Can you imagine Peter in this moment? Like, he's a busy guy. He's like in charge of the church. He's moving around telling everyone about Jesus. He doesn't know Joppa. He doesn't know Tabitha. He doesn't know any of the good deeds she's done. All he knows is this woman's sick and she's gone. I mean, she's been laid out in the upstairs room. Her body has been washed, prepared for burial. And I had to think, what was Peter expecting, right? Like, I wonder if he was thinking, like, oh, I don't know what these people want from me. There's nothing I can do. I guess I'll just show up and I'll, just do a little blessing, commend her soul to God. That's probably what was in Peter's mind. That's what I think was happening. But then when Peter gets there, something happens. Because the scene is nothing like he expected. It's not just friends or family that are gathered there, but it's all the widows stood around him, and they're weeping. And they're showing to him, look at these beautiful robes. Look what Tabitha has done for us. And Peter, when he saw this scene with the women, the widows weeping and showing the robes, his heart was moved. And so he ordered all of the people to leave the room. And he knelt down beside Tabitha's bed. and he prayed. And we don't know what he prayed or how he prayed, but we know that the Spirit moved in that prayer. So that following that prayer, he said to Tabitha, "Get up." And she opened her eyes. And then he took her hand and lifted her up, and he took her out to present her to the community of widows and disciples. And when all heard it, as Abby read earlier, they believed. So here's my question for you. Now that I've gone back through the story, where is Mayode in this story? Where is strength and fullness? Well, it's easy to locate it in Peter, right? I mean, Peter's the one who has the prayer. Peter is the one who lifts her up and, commands her to come back to life and presents her back to the community. And we should certainly give Peter credit. It's through his prayer and compassion that something happens. And I think part of the story, its purpose and intent is to emphasize that in Peter and the apostles, the same Spirit that was in Jesus that allowed him to raise Jairus' daughter and the widow of Nain and others, that same Spirit is present and at work in the disciples. So that's Mayode. But it doesn't stop there. We've already talked about Tabitha had Mayode, right? She used her strength, her fullness in order to care for the poor of her land. And all those widows were there to testify to her impact on their lives. But to me, that's the real twist. Is the place where I see Mayode the most is in all those unnamed women who were gathered around her bedside. Because they couldn't make Peter do anything. They had no position. They had no capital. They had no social, power. They didn't have any wealth. They couldn't pay him to be there. All they had was their story. Look, Peter, look what this person has done for us. And Peter was moved by their story, by their Mayode, by their collective strength. And I don't think, in my theology, that it was just Peter's prayer that worked the miracle that day. I think it was all of their prayers that brought Tabitha back to life. Because it's not, God's fullness isn't just about a single individual being filled with the Spirit. It's about God filling the gifts and strengths of a community of faith. That's Mayode in action. You with me? So here's the point. Is that every single one of us has different skills. We all have different platforms in the world. We all have different opportunities. We all have different relationships. We all have different ways of being in the world. But God has given to each of us strength. You have Mayode, and you have a lot of it. And the question is how you're going to use the Mayode that God has given you. Some of us have the gift of carpentry, and you can go out and build wheelchairs with saws or work on habitat. Some of us have the gift of running, and you can run with Team World Vision and raise money for people who need water throughout the world. Some of us have the gift of music, and you can lead God's people in praise and experience the fullness of his praise. Some of us have gifts in working with people. And whether that's in hospitality, welcoming people who are new to our church, or whether it's the gift of compassion, being a Stephen minister and walking with people who are going through a tough time, visiting people who are sick. Some of us have the gift of prayer. I know there are people in our church who are prayer warriors, and that's Mayode when you kneel as Peter did beside the bedside of those who are sick, and you lift them up to God. Some of us are good with kids. Some of us are good with the senior adults. We all have Mayode. The question, I can't even believe I didn't say this. Some of you are skilled sewers. And guess what? We have a blanket ministry. You saw an example of it. We don't just make blankets for children who are baptized, but for those who are sick. We lift them up in prayer. I don't know what Mayode God has given you, but the question is, how are you giving it back to God? How are you allowing God to use your fullness to fill you, to grow you in order to meet the needs of the world around us? And let me tell you, there is something beautiful about the experience of being filled. I mean, one of the first times I can really consciously remember it was when I was on a mission trip, like our youth just left for. I can remember that experience, that filling, and how wonderful and powerful it was. And when I was done with high school, I returned every summer in college to work at those camps, and that's where I discerned a calling into ministry, because I just felt so alive, and I thought, if I can do this the rest of my life, how beautiful, how wonderful would that be? And I went to Haiti, and I experienced the ability, of using all I had, which was I knew the English language, and teaching people and experiencing life in that, and I experienced it in ministry here. Because there are times where I think I don't know what to preach. There are times when I don't know what to say or how to lead. And yet, I've always experienced God's provision for me and for us together, supplying way beyond what I have the wisdom to do. I think there's some inspiration in that. Let me put this, some of that's, like the God-given gifts, but so much more of it is the meo, the filling, the mala of God continuing to take simple, humble offerings and make it something more. And I don't know what your gifts are. You don't have to be a pastor. Remember, it's not just about Peter. You can be a teacher, a doctor, an accountant, a lawyer, a stay-at-home mom, a construction worker. You can be anything. And you can be the hands and feet of Christ. I was talking to Keith Smith this week, and he was telling me about the food pantry. And he'd gone down recently, I think maybe for one of the first times. He said, I'd never seen it in operation. And he said, what impressed him most was the prayer teams that went out before the people come, they come in cars and they get their delivery of food. Before they receive the food, there's a prayer team that meets with them. And he says these prayer teams, they get to know every person in the car. They take prayer requests. They pray for them. And he says, and sometimes right then and there, people come to a saving knowledge of Jesus Christ. What are your gifts? How is God calling you to use them? The difference between Samson and Tabitha was not a difference in strength. They both possessed meod in different ways. The difference is how they used their strength. Samson, if you read his story, he was foolish, selfish, impulsive. He rarely did anything for anyone else. Only at the end of his life did he have a moment of redemption. But he did such a small fraction of what God gifted him to do and be. Meanwhile, Tabitha, you may say she didn't have much, but what she had, she laid out before God. And God used and blessed and filled her ministry and worked a miracle in and through her. Mother Teresa said, not all of us can do great things, but we can all do small things with great love. So how is God using you? How is God inviting you to share your gifts, to share your strengths, to use your meod, to serve him, and to witness and bless others? Fran's going to play a song here. And this song is going to kind of just wrap up this moment we've been talking about, loving God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength. And I just invite us into a moment of reflection. Will you join me in a word of prayer as we prepare to receive this song? Oh God, we give you thanks. Some days we feel like we don't have much to offer. We don't know if what we do makes a difference. But we give you thanks for the promise, the knowledge that your Spirit can witness and bless the humblest of offerings, the simplest of prayers, and you can make them full. So speak to each of us now. Whisper to us how you have gifted us, how you call us to share those gifts with others. Help us to surrender ourselves in service and worship to you, that we too might experience the amazing infilling of your Spirit, the blessing of when you increase our capacities to do the work that you have set before us. All this we pray in Christ's name. Amen.